Chapter 8. For the first time that evening, perhaps for the first time in a long time, the protagonist's steps had some semblance of purpose. He hurried down a wide, tree-lined boulevard that lazily descended from the city's highlands all the way to the harbor. The boulevard was long and straight, and from his vantage point he could see across many city blocks and intersections, stretching down to the quay on the water's edge. Beyond that was the unlit blackness of the bay, and then beyond that, lights twinkled in the distance, sloping uphill on the other side of the city. Little by little, the fog lifted, but some disquieting thing stayed behind in the streets. A headwind arose and grew stronger as the protagonist descended towards sea level. He pulled the collar of his coat tight against his throat and squinted his eyes against the onrushing wind and dust. Once, the street had been host to numerous parades, but it had been so long since there had been a parade. Through his narrowed eyes, the protagonist saw the memory of his younger self sitting expectantly on the boulevard's curb. With a wide grin on his tiny face, the child's fists pumped up and down as an otherwise invisible procession of marching bands and triumphant soldiers, interspersed with exotic animals and typhonic beasts, strode past. The protagonist was sure that he attended parades long ago, but he couldn't remember the specific details. As the wind died down and his eyes opened fully once again, the child was gone. He continued onward towards the bay. He began to hear sounds emanating from some blocks further ahead. Faint and indistinct at first, they took on the characteristics of screams as he came closer. Then other, softer sounds began to bubble forth into the night air, shrieks of laughter and festive bells, and what could have been the clacking of a train crossing a wooden trestle. After a time, the protagonist arrived at an intersection that led to the source of the noise. A traveling carnival had set down in a vacant lot on a nearby side street. From behind a hastily assembled, tattered canvas fence, the colorful crown of a merry-go-round could be seen swirling. A calliope continually repeated the refrain of a melody originally written about gladiators. Couples and families could be seen exiting the main gate, arms laden with bright balloons and oversized stuffed animals and greasy bags of popcorn. Colorful lights blinked on and off, and the indulgent aroma of grilled meats permeated the protagonist's nostrils. Fireworks suddenly began bursting in the sky overhead. He hesitated for a moment, debating whether he should abandon his goal and join the celebration. The jubilant sights, sounds, and smells of the carnival were enticing, but he looked closely at the smiling, unfamiliar faces of the carnival goers. They were not his tribe. To them, he would always be a stranger, an outsider, someone to be eyed with wary suspicion. He quickly concluded that wandering silently through such a joyful setting would only serve to make him feel more alone and isolated. He could walk among the carnival goers, but he could never walk with them, never be one of them. The protagonist understood that he was only ever able to define himself in terms of what he was not. He was not a lover. He was not a co-worker. He was not a brother-in-arms. He was not a parishioner. He was not a comrade. He was not a carnival goer. His journey tonight had driven home the fact that none of those terms defined him. Was he a hero or a villain? A loyalist or a revolutionary? A failure or a success? Those terms only had meaning in relation to some 0 point he could not demarcate. He certainly existed, he was sure of that much, yet he possessed no milestone or origin point to anchor that existence to, and so he remained undefined and, in a sense, unreal. He turned his back to the fireworks and the jubilation and continued on his mission towards the harbor. As he walked, the sounds of the carnival receded into silence. First, the calliope faded away. then the shrieks of laughter and the festive bells and the clacking of a roller coaster crossing a wooden trestle, until all that could still be heard were the faint and indistinct sound of screams. The protagonist rubbed his hands together as he walked, partially in an attempt to warm himself, but also partially to feel skin against skin, to reassure himself that he possessed actual physical form. Eventually, he reached the end of the boulevard where a long concrete walk ran parallel to the shore. Above him hung a large billboard depicting the cartoonish face of a small child bearing an impossibly huge grin. He stood leaning against an anodized metal balustrade that prevented the unwary from stumbling off the concrete walk and falling onto the sand below. In the middle of the harbor, a large barge was indeed anchored. It appeared to be shoddily constructed, possibly from pieces scavenged from a collection of other boats. Several spotlights danced erratically from both bow and stern. Their beams pierced the darkness of the bay, yet only allowed the hull to be viewed in discrete segments as they swung across the deck. No markings were present to identify the ship or its home port, although someone had sloppily scrawled the words Urim and Thummim in dark spray paint across the side of the hull. The main deck appeared to be piled high with detritus and scrap metal, which remained dimly illuminated by an ever-changing faint blue glow that seemed to dart from between the heaps. Towering high over the improvised vessel was what appeared to be a tall radio antenna. It seemingly stretched infinitely high into the clear night sky. The protagonist hoped for answers. He swung his legs around and jumped down over the balustrade onto the thin beach that separated the sea from the barrier wall. He landed right in front of an Arab man with a determined and angry face. The two looked at each other cautiously, and the Arab fidgeted with an unseen object hidden in his jacket pocket. I'm sorry, I didn't see you there below me. It's dark, said the protagonist. The Arab stared at him for a second with fiery eyes, but ultimately proceeded onward without response. The protagonist began walking the shore in the opposite direction from the Arab, searching for a way to get closer to the barge. Long-forgotten anti-ship fortifications remained and placed on the beach, now covered in incomprehensible graffiti, slowly rusting and sinking into the sand. The sea was too choppy, and the weather far too cold to consider swimming. He stepped gingerly among broken shells and clumps of rotting seaweed. Ahead of him, the beach receded into impenetrable darkness. He turned and debated going in the direction the Arab was headed, in hopes of finding a dock or a ferryman willing to take him. But from that direction he suddenly heard a single gunshot ring out in the night. Then, seconds later, 4 more gunshots in rapid succession. The protagonist quickly decided to pursue the path he was already on and hurried down the dark spit of sand away from whatever violence lay behind him. After a time, he came upon a small rowboat that had been dragged ashore and left abandoned. It was hardly larger than a canoe, but it looked seaworthy enough to suffice to get him to the barge. A set of oars lay conveniently half buried next to the keel. Surreptitiously, the protagonist looked around for signs of the boat's owner, but not a soul was around. He reasoned that as long as he returned the boat before sunrise, the owner would never notice if he borrowed it. He grabbed the cold metal bow and started to push it into the water. His hands ran across a sticker that some joker had attached to the hull. It read, "Warning, this object does not exist," which the protagonist found humorous considering how heavy he found the boat to be. But he managed to get it deep enough into the tide that it began floating. He splashed his way into the boat with the oars and set out rowing towards the barge. The protagonist had little experience piloting boats, and the sea was dark and violent, so progress was slow and meandering. Several times, waves of ice-cold water splashed over the gunwales and onto his pants. He began to shiver forcefully. As the spotlight's beams swept in arcs across the bay, he could catch momentary glimpses of other small boats, containing other pilgrims, also struggling to cross the dark water towards the barge. He continued to row. He bobbed up and down as the waves threatened to overturn his small boat, but the barge seemed eerily immobile and unaffected by the turbulence surrounding it. This was crazy, the protagonist thought to himself. He might very well meet his end in these rough seas. If a book was ever written about his life, this would certainly have to be the climactic chapter. He remembered the woman he'd met earlier. Simone? She had told him she was writing a book. There was a chance, a small chance, that it would include some fictionalized version of her encounter with him tonight. And maybe her book would become a bestseller. If so, he would live on in the minds of future generations. But he realized with some disappointment that Simone had no knowledge of what he was doing right now or what might await him on the strange barge. There was no possibility that she would include his boat trip in her memoir. She barely knew him at all. So even if she did add him as a character, he was certain to be a completely different person. He would forever be remembered as someone that he was not. The victories and struggles of his own life completely overridden by a crude fictionalization. And he was powerless to stop it. Afraid, he buoyed his spirits with the words of that crazed soldier from his dream. He would either make it safely to the barge, or capsize and drown. But if he drowned, he would no longer be here to observe himself drowned. So the only possible result he could ever observe was success. And so he rowed onward. He approached the barge nearest its prow. Several skiffs, canoes, makeshift rafts, and even what looked like a surfboard sat empty and abandoned in the water, being thrown about by the waves. From high above, an unseen hand tossed a rope ladder off the deck. It unfurled as it fell, each rung clanging against the metal hull in turn. The protagonist reached out and grabbed it, and climbed upwards out of his boat. The ladder swayed in the wind as he ascended, several times causing him to momentarily pause and hold on tightly so as not to fall. He made the mistake of looking down, just once, and saw the water, now far below him, almost enticing him to release his grip and plunge into the churning blackness. But he steadily continued upwards. As he reached the top, he was helped on board by an Arelem, patiently waiting under a hand-painted wooden sign that read, Keter. The Arelem grabbed his hand and began guiding him across the deck. The creature tugged at his sleeve, and its touch left an oily residue that faintly glowed. He had never seen an Arelem up close before. It was, of course, impossible to look at it directly. He could only see it as one sees something out of the corner of one's eye. It was organic and alien and clockwork and angelic all at once, and continually transformed and oscillated between its phases, an onslaught of kaleidoscopic shapes that never quite coalesced into a singular form. Their faces were jumbled, abstracted, and leaking colored light. And they sang. The Arelem steered him through what felt like an infinite maze of corridors, haphazardly meandering between rickety wooden crates, mounds of jagged scrap metal, and heaps of random junk. They moved quickly, forwards and backwards, right and left, down and up, through light and through darkness, through good and through evil. At several intersections, the protagonist could see other Arelem hastily dragging along other confused pilgrims behind them down different paths. All the while, the self-transforming machine elves were singing in unison in a hyperdimensional Adamic language that seemed to say, Welcome. We're so glad you're here. As the protagonist and his guide moved from clearing to clearing, he began to recognize items from his past, mixed in among the detritus cluttering the deck. Something about that baby blanket seemed eerily familiar to him. A pile of comic books that he half remembered reading. A pennant from a Little League team he might have played on. Nothing was identifiable enough to be sure, and the Arelem moved too swiftly for the protagonist to pause and contemplate the items as they rushed by. However, he began to wonder about the items he didn't recognize. Were those on the barge because of random chance, for the benefit of other pilgrims? Or could those things also be part of the protagonist's own past, albeit from a time that he had erased from his own mind? A heap of empty liquor bottles, the rusted shell of a car that had once been in a terrible crash, a pistol whose barrel still contained a wisp of smoke. Were these things evidence of something terrible that he willfully chose not to remember? The protagonist wanted to believe that he was a good person, but perhaps that was only a fiction of selective memory. He did not have time to contemplate this idea, as soon the protagonist and his guide arrived at the final clearing, which was located at the very rear of the main deck and directly underneath the massive radio antenna that could be seen from shore. From this vantage point, it was difficult to tell where the antenna ended. It rose up into the sky, seeming infinitely high. It looked as one might imagine an antenna would look if it were rising not upwards in space, but perhaps rising through some indefinable fourth dimension, although that might have just been an optical illusion created by judicious sizing of each segment of the antenna. When the protagonist looked back down, the aerolim that had been guiding him was gone. He was left at the end of a line of people queuing patiently. "Why do you think they built this way out here on this barge?" he asked a woman standing in front of him to pass the time. "Wouldn't it have been easier if they put it on land somewhere?" "It has to be here. Exactly here. The transmitter only works if it's located at the exact geometric center of the universe, and that turned out to be right here in the middle of the bay," she replied. "How do you know that this is the exact center of the universe?" "Look for yourself." She pointed at a mechanism located underneath the antenna, a rotating platform containing an incandescent bulb with several mirrors spinning around its axis, slowly and unchangingly. "Oh, I see," said the protagonist. A number of desks and tables had been indiscriminately arranged on the deck around the base of the antenna. A telephone had been placed on each one. From the phones, wires ran across the deck, each plugged into a large mechanism covered in gears and vacuum tubes and innumerable flashing lights, some of which spelled out the words Malkuth. The mechanism was in turn connected to an antenna by a large cable that pulsed like an artery. At each of these stations sat a pilgrim. Right in front of the protagonist, an older lady was clutching her phone to her ear and crying hysterically. Next to her, a young, angry man was shouting and violently slamming his receiver into the desk. A few stations down, another woman could be heard begging, "Please, please, don't leave me here," over and over again into her handset, her face puffy and dripping with tears and mucus. A man with a wandering eye ended his conversation, carefully placed his handset back on its base, calmly stood up from his station, and walked over to the gunwales. He turned towards the protagonist, and with arms outstretched, he allowed himself to fall backwards over the railing into the icy water below. No one tried to stop him. An aerolim, busy repairing some wiring above, paused, peered down at the protagonist, and with its infinite eyes, offered the now empty seat to him. The protagonist cautiously sat down at the old metallic desk. The seat of the chair was still warm from the previous occupant. The furniture had clearly once been in an office somewhere, and some now anonymous worker had long ago scraped their initials into the surface of the desk. On a green blotter that was covered in scribbles and math sums rested a rotary phone of black bakelite. A small white light on the phone blinked on and off. The protagonist stared at it for a few moments without moving. A woman ran past him, screaming with rage and terror, close enough that her perfume caught his attention as she flew by. The small light on the phone continued to blink on and off. Two nearby men became involved in a fistfight, with several aerolims struggling unsuccessfully to pull them apart. The protagonist could not bring himself to pick up the receiver. Instead, he distracted himself by opening the drawers of the desk. Most were empty, but one contained an addressed, yet unsent, letter that had undoubtedly been left behind long ago when the desk was surplus to whatever junkyard the heirloom had acquired it from. The paper was now yellowed with age. The protagonist was curious of the contents of the letter and wondered if it was left unsent due to simple oversight or willful hesitation on the part of the writer. He considered taking the letter and bringing it to its intended recipient, but decided against doing that. Whatever words the letter contained, the time had long since passed for them to possibly bring any comfort to the reader. The line behind him appeared to be becoming patient. Overcoming his qualms, he reached over and picked up the handset and put the receiver to his ear. "Hello?" he asked sheepishly. There was nothing but silence on the other end. Less than silence. It was almost as if the vacuum was hungrily pulling sound through the receiver to fill an endless void at the other end of the line. It wasn't until that moment that he considered all the things that he could say. Pleas, entreaties, threats, and logical arguments all jumbled competitively through his mind. He gazed up at the impossibly tall antenna he was connected to, and wondered who or what could be at the other end. The protagonist was so unsure of himself and his past, so confused as to how things came to be the way they were in this entropic city. How could he relate to whatever was listening up there? Could there be some perfected, four-dimensional version of his soul hovering above, waiting to hear from him? He imagined the children he'd seen at the arcade earlier, and imagined how they would react if a tiny, pixelated warrior suddenly turned to them and asked for comfort and succor through the screen. Would they understand? Would they even listen? Could they help even if they wanted to? Could anything, even a singular, omnipotent entity existing in all possible higher dimensions, actually twist reality in the protagonist's favor, here in the present? Or had the universe already been superdetermined from its inception, inanimate nature running on behind-the-scenes clockwork, cause precipitating effect, precipitating secondary causes and secondary effects, like balls zooming around a pool table, all following paths that were inexorably predetermined from the moment the cue ball was first struck? And if that were the case, then in the entire history of the universe, only that single initiating cause mattered. And whatever that event was, it was by this point forever unalterable in the distant past. Asking for help now would be as pointless as reaching your hand out to grab a ledge well after you've tumbled off the cliff. Am I even real? Was the question he eventually settled upon asking. He turned to look directly at the reader, but no matter which direction he cast his eyes, he could not see up into the higher dimensions. Straining to see God is like straining to look at the back of your own head. You may know for certain it's close by, but it can never be in view. The phone gave no obvious response to his question. But was a response even possible? Perhaps information can only travel in one direction through the dimensions, from lower order to higher. A fictional character in a book can easily communicate to a reader, but no matter how loud they shout, the reader can never respond in a way the character can perceive. Even if some entity up there could hear him and was sympathetic to his cause, it would not be able to offer him anything but silence. He came to the conclusion that he had been searching for something he could never find. Whether or not there was some underlying eternal and objective meaning to existence was an unresolvable question, since the fundamental laws of the universe prevented anyone living inside of it from ever knowing what that meaning could possibly be. It didn't matter if this city was a real place, or a fictional place, or an allegorical hell completely abandoned by an uncaring creator. But the city didn't require a deeper meaning to exist. It was what it was. He was here. That is all. The protagonist calmly placed the receiver on the base without saying another word. He stood and looked around at the desperate mass of lonely and despondent people who had gathered to plead for some ray of hope that could soothe the pain of their miserable and pointless existence. However real the protagonist was, were they not all as equally real? They seemed to be. At least their suffering seemed to be real. He remembered a parable. A man and a child were walking along a beach that was covered in struggling starfish, tossed out of the sea by the tides. The boy picked up one of the starfish and threw it back into the safety of the water. "Do you realize there are miles and miles of beach and thousands of starfish?" said the father. "You can't make any appreciable difference." "Maybe not," replied the boy. "But at least I made a difference to that one." The protagonist took a deep breath and prayed that God would give him enough time and enough sense and enough strength to be able to tell people what he knew, so they'd know what he knew and not despair so much. He climbed up onto the desk. "Why are we all so alone here?" he shouted to the crowd. "I don't know where we are, I don't know why we are, or what any of this means. But no matter how terrible it is, this is what we have. This is all we have. Can we not make the best of it? Why do we each choose solitary sorrow? What is hell? I maintain that is the suffering of being unable to love. But we can love if we want to love. No one is stopping us except ourselves. We don't need to beg for salvation. We are all right here. Aren't we able to love each other? We don't have to be alone." No one turned to face him. No one listened. No one seemed to have been paying attention to his words. Everyone was lost in their own independent miasma of despair. It was as if they couldn't even see one another, like characters from two different movies simultaneously projected onto the same screen. Each cry of anger and wail of desperation fell on deaf ears, not just on the ears of whatever was on the other end of the aerolim's contraption, but on the ears of their supplicants milling about on the desk. Not a single starfish was saved, thought the protagonist. A communication unfortunately takes two people. He just didn't have the skill to explain his revelation in a way that anyone could understand. His Venn diagram would never intersect with theirs. We are each forever trapped in solitary confinement in the prison behind our own eyes, he thought. They'd have to figure it out for themselves. He got down off the desk. Two pilgrims rushed to take his place and began scuffling over control of the black bakelite phone. The protagonist just walked away in despair. Wandering the serpentine corridors of trash that cluttered the deck, he made one last feeble attempt at connection. He came across a woman leaning against the rusted-out shell of an old car, sobbing quietly. The protagonist hugged her. She jumped back and slapped him in the face. "Don't touch me, you creep," she yelled. He retraced the path that had brought him to the antenna, this time without the help of an aerolim. He lost his way several times, but he eventually found the rope ladder that led to his skiff. As the spotlight swept across the bay in a great arc, he could see more people approaching the barge in their tiny boats. He felt sorry for them.